Man on the Tip by Robert Eastland. Read by Hayley Mills.
I cannot think about Grandad without remembering the incident on Moss Row Tip. Not that it was a real tip as such, more a bleak stretch of derelict land, littered with ash and the rusty iron bones of old industries. There were a lot of places like that around Manchester back in 1965. But Moss Row was the most impressive. Running for about 2 miles in all directions and covered with ridges and craters and the gutted ruins of buildings. Perhaps that's why the film crew chose it. Our house fronted onto the tip, so we were among the first to hear them. It was a Saturday, mid-morning, and I was in the front room watching our small black and white when I heard the wagons outside. The next thing I knew, the whole street had turned out on the pavement, watching the bobbies rope the tip off and advise everyone to keep back. Maybe 10 lorries in all had pulled up and were now disgorging all sorts of people and equipment. Everywhere you looked, there were men taking measurements or setting up lights on poles. Cameras appeared on tripods. A couple of trailers with prefab cabins on the back were drawn up. And far out, on the tip, on a low ridge, people were unravelling coils of rusty barbed wire and hammering wooden sticks in. Only when the soldiers arrived did we get some inkling of what it was all about. Even at my young age, I knew these weren't modern soldiers. They were dressed in khaki and heavy boots, but they carried old-fashioned rifles with bayonets on and wore tin helmets. Some even had sheepskin coats under their fretting straps, and it was obvious they weren't real. For one thing, they didn't stand to attention, but waited around in groups, laughing and talking and smoking cigarettes. I heard a neighbour saying something about it being nearly 50 years since the Battle of the Somme, and that this was a reconstruction for a television documentary. They really went to town on the detail. By lunchtime, grey smoke was drifting across the neighbourhood from thunder flashes which they'd scattered all over the ridge, while the sound effects were equally impressive. An ongoing rattle of machine guns and thump of artillery. A few mothers were a little concerned about that and grabbed all their kids together. But one of the TV men, a bloke with headphones on, laughed and told us not to worry. There was no live ammunition being used, he said. Everything was imitation. The men dressed as soldiers soon got involved. There must have been 50 of them at least, and they made repeated charges towards the ridge. Every time they got there, all the sound effects would start in full. The smoke would billow out, and the actors would start dying before our very eyes, throwing their arms up and screaming, and going down in heaps. Always, though, an older man in Mac and Wellingtons would walk across shouting, "Cut! Cut! Cut!" Then all around him the troops would get up again and walk back to the cabins, where a little stall had been set up to provide them with tea and paper cups. It was early afternoon, and they must have been making their 9th or 10th charge of the day, when I saw Grandad coming down the street. He'd been out since the crack of dawn and had missed it all. He was very stiff and had to walk with a stick, my Grandad. But on this occasion he wasn't even watching where he was going. He was too busy staring at the tip, his eyes almost popping from his head. The actors had just got up to the ridge again and were trying to climb through the wire. The flashes and bangs started and they flopped down one after another, shrieking in agony. Grandad could hardly believe what he was seeing. He stopped to watch about 2 houses from our own, and even though I ran up to him and took his hand, he couldn't speak. When it was all over, he'd gone white as a ghost. Finally, he looked down. "What's all this, lass?" "It's the Battle of the Somme, Grandad," I told him eagerly. "Isn't that where you were? Mum said it was." He didn't answer but looked cross. and glared back at the events on the tip before going straight into our house and slamming the front door behind him. Later on, when I went back in, I heard him upstairs banging about in his room. He usually banged about in there when he was angry. That was normally after he'd been and lost on the dogs, though. Mum was in the kitchen making tea, so I went through and asked her what was wrong. She didn't say anything for a minute, and outside I could still hear the phony gunfire, even though it was starting to get dark. It was like bonfire night. "Your granddad didn't have a very nice time during that war, love," she finally said. "In fact, it was horrible. A lot of his friends got killed, one in particular. He doesn't like being reminded about it. I hated seeing Grandad upset and decided there and then that I wouldn't mention it again. I just wished the TV people would pack up and go home, but somebody outside said that they'd be there for another 2 or 3 days yet. I climbed the stairs and went along the landing to the front bedroom. My dad had been gone a long time by then, so I now shared that room with Mum. I was surprised to find Grandad in there, though, now in his woolly cardigan and slippers, standing by the window, staring out at the battle. I felt there was nothing else I could do but go and join him. It was now getting misty outside as well as dark. The actors were so caked in mud that you couldn't tell one from another, and 3 or 4 imitation wrecked vehicles had been set on fire, so there was a strong smell of oil and burning in the air. I looked up at Grandad. He had a glazed expression on his face, and every time one of those actors threw his hands up and screamed, I saw him wince. Suddenly he turned and looked down at me. He was a tall man, and even though white-haired and stooped, he could look very solemn and stern if he wanted to. That only usually came in church on Sundays, but I got it on this occasion as well. "It was much, much worse than this, you know," he said. I nodded but didn't reply. "By the end of that first day, you couldn't walk for dead men," he went on. "And they were all people you knew, lass. It wasn't like strangers who you didn't care about." His bottom lip started to tremble. One of them was a very good friend of mine. Barney. The best pal I ever had, I reckon. I couldn't believe that I was about to see Grandad cry. My Grandad, who'd first been a soldier, then worked for 40 years on the coalface at Agecroft Colliery. Thankfully I didn't, because Mum suddenly burst in, carrying a bundle of laundry, and immediately started to tell him off. He went grumpily downstairs, and Mum followed, ordering me to wash my hands and face and come down to tea in 5 minutes. I remember standing by the window a little longer, watching the television people. They seemed to have finished for the day and were starting to clear up. The actors were all talking together and laughing and smoking more cigarettes. I noticed that when they took their helmets off, a lot of them had longish, wavy hair like Mick Jagger or Ringo Starr. Grandad would have approved even less if he'd seen that. He was downstairs, meanwhile, having words with Mum. "You know there was nothing I could do, Maureen," he was saying. "There was nothing nobody could have done." "I know, Dad," Mum said back to him in that patient but tired voice of hers. "I wish you'd stop talking about it, though. It's all over and done with now." "I don't talk about it that much," he said gruffly. "Every now and then," she said, "but once is enough. It's over now. There's nothing you can do about it." "Maybe I could have done," he said, "if I'd had the guts." "Oh, for God's sake, Dad, what do you mean, guts? You were only 18. It was hardly a matter of guts." Grandad didn't say anything for a while. but when he did, it was very soft. I could hear him crying out, you know, Pet, calling my name, over and over again. All that night it went on, and I just lay there in the trench listening to it, and did nothing about it. I was nervous about going down for tea that evening, but when I did, I was surprised to find everything all right. Grandad was even friendlier than usual and gave me a cuddle when we sat at the kitchen table. Later, when Mum and myself settled down in front of the TV, Grandad joined us. Mum looked at him suspiciously and asked him why he wasn't going out to the Legion, like he usually did. He made an excuse about not feeling up to it, but then spent 2 hours shifting restlessly in his armchair, and only much later on went for his coat and cap and said that he'd go and have a couple of quick stouts after all. Mum and myself had both been in bed a good while when we heard him coming back. His stick clicking along the pavement was a very familiar sound to me on Saturday nights, and I always knew that it was okay to go to sleep when I heard that. This time he didn't come straight inside, though, and after a minute, puzzled, I went to the window and moved the curtain to have a look out. Grandad was on the other side of the road, gazing out over the tip. The moon was up, and it all gleamed wetly in a ghostly radiance. Every piece of rubble burnished with silver, every coil of wire, every ridge, and every pit and pool of water. Grandad was standing there on the edge of it, like a statue of black iron. For some reason, I decided that he wouldn't be angry if I went out there with him. So I put my duffel coat on over my pyjamas and a pair of Wellingtons and crept downstairs. The front door was only on the latch, so I let myself out and walked across the road. Grandad looked round but didn't seem surprised to see me. We both stood there for a moment, watching. The smell of acrid smoke had still not gone away. In fact, it seemed stronger and made me want to cough. "Did you hear it, lass?" he finally asked me in a whisper. "Hear what, Grandad?" "Listen. You'll hear it," he said. We listened for a moment or two and heard nothing. "There!" Grandad suddenly hissed. "Did you hear it that time?" I didn't know what to say, but now Grandad seemed excited. I strained my ears but still heard nothing. And then, suddenly, "Arthur! Arthur, please!" I heard it. Very weak and seemingly far away, but I distinctly heard it. I looked up at Grandad, bewildered. But he seemed transported with joy and seized me by the shoulder. "Come on, Pet," he said. "I'll need you, but keep low." And we set off onto the tip, moving with more agility than I'd ever realised he was capable of. I had to trot to keep up, but was soon ploughing through thick, treacly mud and heaps of broken bricks. Grandad took it all in his stride, however, constantly encouraging me with things like, "That's a good lass, keep up," or "You're doing great, but if I say duck, duck." We got to the ridge almost immediately, and all over it I could see holes in the ground where the thunder flashes had been buried. Smoke was still wisping out of some of them. Grandad wasn't content yet, though. He started to batter the barbed wire down with his walking stick in big, sweeping, angry strokes. "Always was a bugger, this stuff," he grunted, sweat gleaming on his brow. "Grandad," I said, "you're going to hurt yourself." If he heard me, he gave no sign. I remember looking back and seeing our house on the other side of the streetlights, just one in an unbroken wall of red brick, 2 up, 2 downs. Then that voice came to us again, from somewhere just ahead. "Arthur!" it wailed pathetically. "I'm coming, lad," Grandad said. Taking my hand, he pressed on, stepping over the flattened wire, telling me to be careful with it. We started down a steep hill, over more slippery rubble. At the bottom of it, a lodge glittered in the moonlight. "Got your wellies on, I hope," Grandad said. He was breathing very hard. I nodded, but hardly had a chance to speak, for he suddenly went down on one knee, clutching at his chest, making a rasping, wheezing sound. His eyes looked like they were about to pop out of his head. I felt his hand go cold in mine. I was frozen for a second, not knowing what to do, when right behind us a thunder flash went off. I remember looking round to the top of the ridge as a plume of fire spurted up into the air, 20 feet or more. I felt the loose ground shaking beneath me. The next thing I knew, though, Grandad was back on his feet, nudging me to hurry. I asked him if he was okay, and he said he was. We waded through the lodge and found ourselves in a morass of mud, which slowed us down even more. It was almost over the tops of my boots. Not too far away, though, thought I heard what sounded like a car backfiring. Somehow, though, I knew it wasn't that. If it was, it backfired several times more over the next few minutes. And from the other side of the tip, 2 or 3 other cars started backfiring in direct response. The ground rose steeply up in front of us again, and we almost had to crawl. By the time we got to the top of that one, I was absolutely whacked. I didn't know how Grandad could cope. Just before we plunged down into the next valley, I looked around and saw another thunder flash go off about a half a mile away. It lit up the landscape in a blood-red glare, and again the ground shook. There was now a terrible smell about the place, and then I heard a machine gun start up. "Arthur!" The voice pleaded again. It seemed closer now, but a lot weaker. "Not so far," Grandad said. We followed a narrow gully through another fence of barbed wire. I'd never realised the tip was so big, because then we came out over more open ground, and all I could see for miles was the ravaged terrain and jet-black sky. Occasionally a light would streak across it, and somewhere in the distance we'd hear a shrill scream followed by a loud thump. "Arthur?" the voice said, quite close to us. "I'm here, lad. Stop your fretting," Grandad replied. Over the next rise, we found a figure lying curled up in a crater. At first I thought it was a dummy. He was so plastered in mud from head to toe that I couldn't identify him as a living man. He was, though, because as we scrambled down to him, he started to move. He didn't say much as we helped him up, just whimpered, but managed to get one arm around each of our necks and limped badly as we walked him back. If the outward trip had been bad, the return was infinitely worse. Grandad was constantly telling us to get down as machine guns suddenly started to hammer and objects whistled over our heads. The mud seemed more like porridge swimming around our knees, and the smells now an unbearable stench which lingered everywhere. We pressed on bravely, despite all, and gradually it began to fall behind us. At last we came to that first ridge, and the lines of wire put up by the television people. The ground seemed firmer underfoot there, the air sweeter. I could still hear the thump and crash of guns, but it was far in the background. By the time we got to the edge of the road, I could hardly hear anything. I was utterly worn out, however, too physically drained even to worry what Mum was going to say about the state of my pyjamas. The man from the tip was now a dead weight on my arm. It was a good thing that Grandad was doing most of the carrying. When we got to the front step, he stood back and actually lifted the man up over his shoulder like a fireman would, while I opened the door. Then he carried him inside by himself, moving straight into the darkened front room and placing him on the couch. I was amazed how strong he was. "You're a good lass," he said to me, as he leaned over the man and loosened his tunic. "Now get on upstairs to bed, eh? Best not let your mam catch you up at this hour." I knew he was right. I took one look back into the room before I went. Grandad stood up again, and I saw him silhouetted against the window. I never realised what a firm jaw he had, what a sturdy neck and big shoulders. "Go on, pet," he said in a gentle voice. I did. The next day, Moss Row Tip was back to being an ordinary tip, and they were filming on it again. But obviously things had to change. There were certain people who just couldn't accept what had happened. People who weren't a million miles away from us. People like Mum. But we can all get used to anything if we try hard enough. And Mum eventually did. God rest her soul. Personally, I didn't believe that the man they found kneeling out there the next day, one hand on his heart, was Grandad. I still see him, you see, even now. Him and his mate, in the pub, down the bookies. They're inseparable. Always so cheerful, always winking. Gives me a nice warm feeling inside when I see that. It's just a shame I'm the only one who does.